This man represents hatred!
You're bored!
This video, as the title suggests, is a retrospective on Milo Yiannopolous' college speaking tour in 2016. I want to go back to it and explain what it meant to me at the time as a sophomore in college, and also what Milo meant to student organizations and activists at the time. Milo Yiannopolous, then a tech editor at Breitbart, launched a college speaking tour in early 2016. At least those are the first videos I could find. Until he got cancelled in early 2017 for comments about pedophilia.
Trying to out pedophiles?
No, trying to go on this
You were the one who was anti-pedophile earlier.
I told you it wasn't the pedophilia. I was after I'd lost my virginity. I was in my teens. I was in my teens.
14.
I was in my teens.
You said you were 14.
Something like that.
That's what you said. 14 is pedophilia, buddy. I don't know how they rock it in merry old England.
I was in my teens.
Over here in my country, and fucking where you are right now,
You've never seen a 15-year-old girl at any point in your life, however old you were, you've never seen a 15-year-old girl you thought was hot?
Yeah, when I was 15.
No, when you were 25. When you were 25.
I'm not retarded, dude.
When you were 25, when you were 30, you will have seen girls about 15 you thought were hot.
No,
of course
I thought they were little
did.
kids.
Recently, Milo has been trying out a rebrand by becoming straight and promoting gay conversion therapy, when being gay used to be a pretty big part of his brand. And also picking a fight with Proud Boy leader Enrique Tarrio, but that's beyond this video. The basic format of these college speaking events, at least at first, was to combine crude comments designed to provoke anger and disgust in many college students with ordinary Republican talking points.
That's a sort of tyranny, and it's coming to an end. And the people who benefit from that tyranny, the mediocre, the lazy, the hateful, the fat, the facially pierced, the blue-haired, the people for whom being black is their only marketable skill.
What are the other things that Black Lives Matter wants? Well, it wants segregated dorms. So did the KKK. It stokes racial tensions and hatred. So does the KKK. Many things that Black Lives Matter want look remarkably like the KKK. Why? Because it is ultimately a black supremacist movement, not an equality movement. And it has that flaw in common with feminism. It is not about equality.
From an organizing perspective, Milo's college tour was actually very interesting. Many of his tours were hosted by regular college organizations, such as College Republicans, the Leadership Institute, Turning Point USA, Young Americans for Liberty, or some combination of organizations. The famous protests against his tour were also organized and discussed before the fact, and were sometimes controversial among the activists themselves. I spoke with one of these activists, and her insights will be included in this video. The most famous element of his tour had to have been the protests against Milo. The earliest one that I saw was at Rutgers University in February 2016. Organizers would gradually get better at security, and at later events, Milo would sometimes speak with little or no interruption. The protests were ritualized, or at least the reaction to them were. Milo would deliberately provoke them. The cameras would frequently pivot to them. The host audience would often chant them down. It was part of the performance, and I think it was the primary source of Milo's fame and the cult-like affection given to him at the time.
Which actually doesn't sound so bad when you put it like that. Maybe that's all right. Oh. It's funny. I love that USA has become the sort of. Oh, you wish, baby. Oh. I wish they'd come and ask questions. I want them to come and ask. What's that, darling? No. The sad reality is I don't need to. I mean, I would. I'd be perfectly happy to stage a bit of drama, you know. It'd be like one of those plays where the actors are planted in the audience, you know. I'd be perfectly happy to do it. No, I'm sorry to tell you, your campuses really are this crap.
The organizers of these events would often state that they did not endorse what Milo was saying, but that they believed in his right to say them. I mean, I would say the same for myself, even today. But it was obvious that this was a disingenuous disclaimer. Milo was brought in on a throne at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and applauded and fawned over at many other events by college Republicans and other conservative college students. He was clearly an honored guest of campus Republican groups, and not merely free speech for its own sake. There were also some interesting historical nuggets from the tour. For example, I was reminded that the phrase fake news actually began as a slur that left-wing media and academia used and created to describe right-wing misinformation, and that it didn't become, this catch-all phrase for all media bad for Trump until Trump started using it aggressively in 2016. 2016 was a really long time ago.
Now it's all Russian hackers, name-calling, trying to blame everyone, calling the conservative press fake news is their latest thing. Fake news. Fake news. You got some fucking gall. Fake news. Fake news from the media that was telling us Trump couldn't win.
You could also see some of the seeds of delusion that would later come to define the Republican Party.
Why isn't the American left fighting slavery today on a global scale? Why is it still revisiting the sins of the past? Well, I won't say anything about modern slavery involving child sex trafficking, which is pizza for another day. I'm still not allowed to do that one. I know they did it. No, well, it's so easy to believe. It's so easy to believe, isn't it? Okay, all right, but internet conspiracy theories. Don't get me started, because I believe them all. One of the Democrats' most important tricks is to keep dead people on the voter registration rolls. The dead are among the Democrats' most loyal voter blocks, more loyal even than blacks.
Why do dead people always vote Democrat?
That is the question of the day, is it not?
Yeah. It's remarkable. So how no matter what your opinions when you were alive,
yes,
as soon as you die, you show up on the voter rolls as a Democrat voter.
I think it's noteworthy that the most obnoxious conservative influencer of 2016 only mentioned dead people voting, while the conservative head of Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk, would pay for buses of Trump supporters to attend the Stop the Steal rally and Capitol riot in 2021. 2016 was a long time ago, and a lot has happened since. Milo played a huge role in expanding what it was possible for conservatives to say out loud, especially on college campuses. The ritualization of protests and its plan to capture on film is what college Republican activists are often trained to do. Back in March of this year, I attended an online training class with the Leadership Institute. I didn't tell them I was a reporter. The Leadership Institute trains young Republican activists and works closely with the other college organizations that hosted Milo during his tour, like the ones I mentioned before: Turning Point USA, Young Americans for Liberty, Young Americans for Freedom, College Republicans, etc. I downloaded the training videos from that class, and I still have them saved. And in one of them, young Republican activists are specifically instructed to make sure that they film protesters of any events that they might host.
Protest. We talked earlier. Designate people to definitely for photography, but also you can designate people who are ready. Wyatt pointed out Triggerpuff. That's a TBT. But you can designate people who are prepared to film from different angles. So spread out 3, 4, 2, at least 2 people that are kind of savvy as well, that can kind of see that a protest may be about to break out or whatever have you. So they can capture all of it. Because if you didn't film it, it didn't happen. I don't care if someone, punched somebody or something crazy went happen or whatever happened. If you didn't film it, it doesn't matter. It didn't happen. And then immediately send that footage to Campus Reform. You can send it to contact@Campus Reform. It's their tip line. And they can write a story about it. If you are a Campus Reform correspondent, you can get paid for it. or notify a regional field coordinator if you're working on campus. This may be different, if you're working on a campaign or whatever have you, but definitely send it to campusreform.org.
This was a private training. I had to sign up for it and shit. If you remember the Milo tour, then you probably remember the Trigglypuff, the example the instructor uses. The Trigglypuff, as she was called, not a real name, was actually a protester at a Milo event in which Christina Hoff Sommers was also invited. This took place at the University of Massachusetts in April of 2016.
Utter madness.
You're not welcome here! Stop talking to us like children! You're not welcome here!
Stop acting like a child.
The instructor clearly had Milo on his mind while he was teaching this part of the class.
Yes, you want a controversial speaker, but also don't just go straight controversy. Do I even want to talk about? I'll talk about them. So back in the day, this wasn't back in the day, but I guess 4 years ago now, there was a guy named Milo, and some of you may have remembered Milo, and he was very controversial. And for a bit, everyone was like, oh, we got to bring Milo, this is great, blah, blah, blah. But he was just controversial. There was not a lot of education behind it. Towards the end of his little speaking tour, there wasn't a lot of educational things. There were some, but it was just controversial. So it his events ended up not being very successful, or they seemed successful, a lot of people and all, but they didn't get any point across.
The comments from the Zoom call are lost to history, but I can tell you from memory that no one in the chat brought up Milo. The instructor brought it up on his own without having to be asked about him. And this training was about 5 years after the peak of Milo's college tour. The instructor disowns Milo, which is interesting. He says that Milo was all provocation and no substance, which not only isn't true, but misses an important part of his appeal, especially to his liberal and libertarian fans. Milo actually could deploy reasonability and rhetorical concessions with more talent than most, and spent much of his time explaining the virtues of free speech, and this broadened his appeal considerably.
Why? Because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the more you hear from these people, the more you realize what they're really like. In all things, at all times, in all circumstances, and in all forums, more speech is always better than less. And I'll give you a little example, which is my favorite example, which probably everyone in the room has heard already, but it's worth repeating, which is that Nick Griffin, who is a leader of the BNP, a racist party in England, in Britain, was enjoying some quite chilling and disturbing success in Britain. He was preying on people's understandable anxieties about immigration, the changing character of their communities. The little seat they had when the public got to see what this man was like. That's what I want.
And that's what he got. The instructor comes close to saying that Milo's lectures weren't successful, which also isn't true because Milo was hysterically popular everywhere he went. The instructor says that Milo didn't get his point across. Yes, he did. He got the same point across that Turning Point USA and Blexit have pushed since Milo's early retirement, often using the same exact words. That point being, you shouldn't feel bad for saying bigoted things out loud and for endorsing state violence against outgroups. This was also a pretty weak way of disowning someone who was in correspondence with white supremacists at the time this lecture tour was happening.
Civilizationally speaking, we are being outbred, to put it in animal terms. There are existential threats to our way of life, growing everywhere in the world. Most obviously, and most threateningly, from the Middle East, from the Islamic world, where migration happens, those families have many, many children. And in many cases, birth rates are dropping or evaporating in the West.
Milo would also challenge common misunderstandings among leftist activists, especially the wage gap. Many believed then, and now, that women are paid on average 77% of what men make, controlling for all sorts of things, leaving only prejudice behind to account for the gap.
No serious economist takes the wage gap seriously. Women aren't paid differently for the same work as men. You need to revisit the dictionary and learn the difference between wages and earnings.
According to the Department of Labor, the wage gap in 2016 was about 80%, and this number only accounted for part-time versus full-time, and not things like job title, industry, employer, area of the country, job performance, education, experience, or hours worked past full-time, or really anything else that might influence wages apart from prejudice. The wage gap is complicated, and you can definitely argue that women being overrepresented in lower-earning fields is itself a result of systemic sexism. No argument for me there. But the belief that a woman will get paid 77% for the same work as a man isn't and wasn't supported by evidence. Milo leveraged these things to appear reasonable, and saying that he was merely provocative does not account for his popularity. It is interesting that Milo Yiannopolous and his college tour still very much lives in the collective memory of the people who train young conservative activists, and that this still exists in their memory 5 years after the fact. But what's more important, though, I think, is that they see protests of speakers as an opportunity to be seized, and not really an obstruction or a problem to their movement as a whole. Student activists should expect protests, and are told specifically to capture them for their advantage. This is how they speak about protesters when they think nobody's listening, remember. They did not say or suggest that they were worried that being shut down would hurt their movement. I think the significance of this is that conservative leaders think these protests were good for them. They were certainly good for Milo. I doubt I would have heard of him if it were not for the protests, and I certainly wouldn't have cared about him. At events where Milo wasn't protested, or was protested very little, it was very obvious how much he depended on the protests for content, if only just to fill time. He often repeated the same talking points, and made the same silly jokes about feminists' weight or appearance. And when there was nobody there to protest, he would laugh at his own jokes, and it looked like he was using them to stall for time. He was lost and unsure of himself, without being protested. I spoke with Dominic DeCesar as part of the process of making this video. He was the president of the Young Americans for Liberty at the University of California at Santa Barbara, or UCSB. He was the president at the time Milo was hosted in May of 2016, but not at the time he was invited. He confirmed to me that Milo was invited because he was popular, and that no YAL members opposed his invitation. He also explained that many members felt more comfortable being conservatives on campus, both as a result of the protests themselves and Milo's over-the-topness, which Dominic explained made them more tame possible. This point that Dominic makes, that Milo provided a buffer for tamer views to be more readily accepted and respected even, is important, and I'll come back to it. You might be able to tell that I think the protests against Milo were at least partially counterproductive. That's because that is what I think. I did, however, speak to a Miriam Izumju, who was one of the organizers at Rutgers University. She was kind enough to answer all of my questions in essay format. So, Miriam, if you're watching, thanks. You didn't have to do that, but thank you. I asked her specifically about the protest at Rutgers University, in which she participated. I want to read some sections from her response at length, since they were very thoughtful, and did help me understand a lot that I didn't understand before. First, she sets important context for the protest. She talked about how there had been swastikas graffitied around campus, and that there were buildings named after slave owners on and around campus, and that Rutgers had a revolutionary for 250 years campaign that she says glorified colonialism. Also, Trump was running for president at the time and having success in the Republican primaries. She told me that the chosen method of protest was actually controversial among other activists. She describes more experienced activists and Trotskyists who were more goal and result-oriented and thought the protest was merely theatrical. She wrote that the protest was supposed to disrupt Milo's speech, which it did because he immediately went to Q&A after. This is true, but it's probably a generous interpretation of what happened. Milo didn't really prepare for these events, as would become obvious later when he wasn't always protested. And he counted on protests happening. Once the protest happened, he had what he wanted, and was probably more than happy to switch to Q&A.
Thank you. Still my favorite of the audience. I think we've reached the limit of what we can constructively get through. I have more. We're going to move on to ask questions. I'm going to ask you, the questions are the fun bits, whatever way it comes to. So,
There was one part of a response in particular that really did affect how I understood the protests against Milo Yiannopolous' lectures. And so I do want to just read that whole response in its entirety. I think the blood smearing was unfortunately the focus, which good. Protests should disrupt. But for some more experienced, direct action-oriented folks, they kept asking, yeah, but what's the result of this? They had very goal-oriented plans for protests, rather than seeing the symbolic/effective reverberations of the event, i.e., you protest a budget, you protest a policy, but you don't protest hate speech. I think it's because many of them do not confront racist comments directed at them in their everyday lives. For those activists, direct action is not effective/emotional, but later we would learn how important and manipulative affect, rhetoric, and emotional language can be in galvanizing an electorate base. Also, another preface. We still didn't know Trump would be elected at this time, but we would see these effective/pot-stirring attack tactics again and again over the course of the next 4 years. And I want to defend the space for protest to be symbolic too, especially when the weapons on the other side are emotional tools. In the terms of direct action, or practically speaking, the objectives were met in that the smearing of red paint at least cut the speech short. And I think it is useful for people of color in the crowd, who came out in support of our action and to protest Milo as well, to know that they were supported on campus and that this kind of uninterrupted speech would not be tolerated in a space of learning and discourse. At worst, the protests made a lot of us exhausted. I had checked out after my friends and I were targets of rape and death threats. The campus felt unsafe after seeing white nationalists spewing hate speech openly. There was a group of experienced white activists who thought we were amateur, ineffectual dramatists. But for a far and few, there were also student leftists, professors, Rutgers faculty union members, the LGBTQ orgs, Latin and Caribbean studies organizations and departments who loved us, partook in the protest itself, and supported us all around, and checked in on us. It was a time of questioning myself and if I did the right thing. But after seeing that Trump was elected, hearing the kind of effective rhetoric be spewed again and again, if someone doesn't cut it short, who will? You sometimes can't argue with that rhetoric because it is so dehumanizing. It needs to be recognized as a dehumanizing tool on an effective level, because no matter how many facts you throw at it, the machine will still run. Somehow, those of us who protested intuitively understood that. And now, only 5 years later, after Trump, after the insurrection, that I was right to stand up for what was ultimately ethical, even if the method seemed unmethodical. Our protests reacted to the effective space being created, and what should only be a space of discourse and education. The protest helped energize not only the Milo supporters, but his opponents, which is something I hadn't considered before. You could have added, and I suspect would probably agree, that Milo supported state violence against minorities when he spoke about things like ICE kidnappings and grab and grope, aka stop and frisk, and that these protests created emotional discomfort in Milo supporters, just like how Milo's words created discomfort and often worse in his opponents. Okay, so now I want to talk about myself for a minute and what Milo meant for me at the time when I was a 20-year-old college student. When I was in college, I was on the debate team for my school, the College of New Jersey, in a debate league called the American Parliamentary Debate Association, or APTA. I attended a debate tournament at Rutgers University sometime in February of 2016. Since Rutgers was the host, they provided the judges for debate rounds. In one round I was in, I think it was against a team from George Washington University, but I don't exactly remember. They proposed a debate on the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The debate was an op-choice debate, which means that the team receiving the question gets to pick which side they want. So they set up the debate. You are a young black man in 1960s America. Do you join an explicitly peaceful organization, or one that endorses violence and self-defense, such as the Black Panthers, or something to that effect? Me and my partner picked the peaceful movement and argued for that. One argument we made was that peaceful movements tend to be more inclusive, because violent movements can be intimidating to anyone who isn't a young, able-bodied man. This, as far as I can tell, is an empirical fact. Militias and other self-defense groups are clearly more male-driven than protest movements, which is not to say that they are male-exclusive, of course. The judge for my round reported me to the league for making this argument. She reported me to the equity box, which is the way debaters and judges could report others for doing things or saying things that made the league less equitable or inclusive. Nothing came of this. I wasn't even given a warning. The president of my debate team, who was very progressive, agreed with my argument and thought her complaint was vague. The president of APTA itself, another Rutgers student, said my argument was objectively true. But it really bothered me that someone would try to throw me out of a debate tournament for what I said. I had learned this fact about violent movements from a class I took or was taking, and I felt good about being able to apply it to the debate round. So being called a sexist for it was kind of annoying. But why does this matter? Well, the judge who reported me is actually the exact same person who would shout, "This man represents hatred," and smear red paint on her face about a week or two later at Rutgers during a Milo lecture. So I actually tried to contact her when I was making this video. I wasn't able to find any contact information, so I'm going to omit her name from this video on that basis, since that probably reflects some effort on her part to not be contacted at all. I'm aware that this incident had way more impact on me than it probably should have, but I was 20 years old, and this is what drew me to Milo Yiannopolous in the first place. I kind of got off on the wrong foot with opponents of Milo. I liked Milo at first, not because I agreed with what he was saying. I actually thought he was really stupid, especially on immigration and policing.
Take a perhaps harder line on this than many people would. I think that Giuliani and stop and frisk and all of these things are profoundly good things for the black community. Progressives will say, well, stop and frisk. Well, 90% of people were innocent. I was like organizing a society, and that means 1 in 10 weren't. 1 in 10 people you stop has got drugs or a gun on them? Are you kidding me? Frisk the fucking lot of them. Stop and frisk is a brief stop and questioning of a suspicious person who might have been involved in a crime or might be about to commit a crime. New York cops in the city's worst neighborhoods actively stopped upwards of 500,000 people a year at the height of the program, around 88% of which went on their way with no issue. It's those 12% who had weapons, drugs, and other criminal intent that were caught through stop and frisk. Now, just think about that for a second. Over 1 in 10 people stopped had done something wrong. Over 10%, 12%. That's pretty good, isn't it? That's like a pretty good program. You think, yeah, that's probably quite a good use of police time. Yeah.
In high school, I enjoyed the videos of the journalist and celebrity atheist Christopher Hitchens. I was already an atheist by that time, and I thought very highly of Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. I didn't really like Sam Harris then, and I still don't. I resented, and still resent, that criticizing or mocking any religion, including Islam, could be considered bigoted, in its own right, that is. So I saw Milo as opening space for new atheists, even though Milo wasn't one himself. Milo would also mention Hitchens approvingly many times in his tour, and I'm not sure why he would do this exactly, but I did notice it.
The foundation of American thought is don't fucking listen to British people, so what made you want to come to the US?
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. You say that, but then there's Christopher Hitchens. Those of you who don't remember this, because most of you are too young, I would encourage you to read 2 books. One of them is Ann Coulter's book on Bill Clinton, and the other is Christopher Hitchens' book.
He also limited his criticism of atheists to saying they were too sensitive, when as a Catholic fundamentalist, he could have gone much further. He may have believed that atheists were a good recruitment target, and he may not have been wrong. Dominic told me that he was an edgy atheist at the time. Milo also would criticize religious censorship of video games and other media, and compare it to feminist calls for censorship. And this appeal seems specifically designed for male atheists.
I once wrote we had a wishing we had a religious right. Now, it's strange to you as Americans, and I would agree with you to a point, to be hankering after the religious right that did so much to mislead and to badger and to harangue and to bully people in the 90s. The religious right in the 90s were a problem. They were telling lies. They were saying video games could make you violent. Marilyn Manson could turn you into a school shooter. This was odious horse shit. It wasn't true. Just like when feminists say video games can turn you into a sexist. Bullshit. And the oppressors and the school mom.
As more and more protests interrupted his events, it became more than just a sympathy. As I identified more with him, I felt that the verbal attacks on him were aggressions toward me also. Much has been written of the new atheist to alt-right pipeline. I think both too much and too little has been said about it. I think I may have been briefly on this pipeline, although a few things kept me off of it. I actually remember the exact moment I stopped liking Milo. I had been growing more and more skeptical of him as the months went on, and as Trump got the Republican nomination, not taking Trump seriously as a candidate until it was too late made it easier to not take Milo seriously until it was too late. But I finally decided he was an idiot and not to be taken seriously when he did a talk that went completely uninterrupted in Minnesota, in which he argued that the Catholic Church is right about everything. This lecture is dumb as shit for many reasons. When I saw this, I recalled a debate in which Christopher Hitchens argued against the proposal that the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world at all.
The same euphemism comes in the term some Christians that is used in all the apologies about the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the anti-Semitic pogroms, and all the rest of it. It says some Christians fell into error. Some Christians allowed themselves to be deceived in this way and to act against the gospel. Well, anti-Semitism was preached as an official doctrine of the church until 1964. Do you think that might have something to do with public opinion in Austria and Bavaria and Poland and Lithuania? That the Jewish people were accused collectively as a people of deicide, of the crime of the murder of God in the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. And that anathema on them was not lifted until 64, well after the perpetrators of the Holocaust had stood trial in secular courts and been rightly punished for their actions. How can this church say it has any moral superiority? It has difficulty catching up to what ordinary people regard as common moral and ethical sense.
So even though New Atheism got me on that pipeline, it even more forcefully knocked me off of it. But in my case, I actually did need to hear him talk uninterrupted to fully realize he was a dangerous idiot. Others realized it earlier. In Milo's case, at least for me, sunlight really was the best disinfectant. I think Milo was at his weakest when people did not protest him, and you can see that in his desperation today. His gay therapy stuff is about as dumb as the stuff he said before, but since he doesn't attract the protests he once did, it doesn't get the same publicity it once did. I do have more perspective on why these protests happened, but I'm still skeptical that they were smart strategically. They gave Milo way more clout and attention than he would have had otherwise. Milo's college tour probably wasn't the first of its kind, but it was the first that I saw, since I was a sophomore in college when it began. Milo really pioneered this format and made similar projects possible for people like Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro, who were kind of riding his coattails at the time. Even though they have disowned him now, he did help energize college Republican activists for the organizations who hosted him. He also set the table for the trope that had existed already, but that Turning Point USA would beat to death: the archetype of a minority with conservative beliefs. Milo would frequently use his homosexuality and relationships with black men as rhetorical leverage during the tour. Milo proved that this tactic and this format was exhilarating for conservatives in need of reassurance that they aren't bigoted, and Turning Point USA would use this again and again and again. The Blexit movement exists for this purpose alone. Milo was the first to really get the college talk format down, and others would have tried to tap into it. I think arguably made Candace Owens and Blexit possible, as Turning Point USA looked for a replacement for the conservative minority trope or niche that Milo left vacant when he was fired from Breitbart. If you like this video, maybe consider subscribing. Also subscribe if you didn't like the video. Maybe check out my blog and my Patreon too. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.